The lemonade cup was still half full when Piper Grant disappeared. It sat sweating on the edge of a picnic table at the Caddo County Fairgrounds, 3 ice cubes still floating in it. On the evening of July 16, 1988, Elk Hollow, Oklahoma, population 1 in 40, had turned out for the summer fair the way it did every year. The smell of funnel cake and diesel from the generators. The tinny music of the carousel turning under a sky going pink at the edges. Ruth Grant looked away from her 6-year-old daughter for maybe 90 seconds, long enough to pay for 2 corn dogs. When she turned back, the bench was empty. The lemonade was still cold. For 36 years, this town believed it knew what happened to that little girl. They dragged the Washita River. They searched the culverts and the wheat fields until the wheat was cut and there was nowhere left to look. They buried her in their minds, because that was the only place there was to bury her. Everyone assumed the worst. Everyone was wrong. But before we get to the phone call that changed everything, before we get to the woman in Missouri who took a DNA test on an ordinary Tuesday and learned she was somebody else, we have to go back to that fairground. Because to understand what was stolen, you first have to understand who Piper Grant was. Elk Hollow, in the summer of 1988, was the kind of place that doesn't really exist anymore, and maybe never quite did, outside the memories of the people who lived there. It was a farming town stitched together by red dirt roads and section lines, where the grain elevator was the tallest thing for 20 miles, and the whole county's week bent around Friday night and Sunday morning. Everyone knew everyone. Doors stayed unlocked. Kids rode their bikes to the dairy mart and nobody worried, because worrying about children was something that happened in Oklahoma City, on the evening news, to other people. The Grants lived in a white clapboard house at the end of Persimmon Road, with a wraparound porch and a screen door that Wade Grant kept meaning to fix and never did. Wade worked the oil service rigs out past Anadarko. Ruth kept the books at the co-op and sang alto in the First Baptist Choir. They had 2 children. Danny was 12 that summer, all elbows and Nintendo cartridges, and a paper route he hated. And then there was Piper. Piper was 6, and she was the kind of 6 that fills a whole house. She had a gap where her front tooth used to be, and a laugh that Ruth said she could hear from the garden. She rode a red bicycle with a bent training wheel that clicked against the frame, and she refused to let Wade fix it because she liked the sound. She carried a stuffed gray rabbit named Biscuit everywhere she went, to the dinner table, to church, to bed, its ears worn thin from being held. She wanted to be a veterinarian or a mermaid, and had not yet been told she'd have to choose. That July, she'd lost her first tooth and put it under her pillow, and the tooth fairy had left her a shiny Susan B. Anthony dollar that she kept in the front pocket of her overalls. She had it with her at the fair. Records from that night would later note the coin, because it was one of the few specific things anyone could say for certain she was carrying. The fair came to Caddo County every year in the 3rd week of July. For a 6-year-old, it was the biggest night of the summer. The lights, the carousel, the smell of kettle corn drifting across the parking lot. Piper had been talking about it for a week. That evening, Ruth curled her hair and let her wear her good sandals. She never knew that when she buckled those little sandals, she was dressing her daughter for the last ordinary evening either of them would have for 36 years. The Grants arrived at the fairgrounds a little after 6. According to the account Ruth later gave investigators, the evening was ordinary in every way. Wade ran into men he knew from the rigs. Danny begged $5 for the ring toss. Piper rode the carousel twice, waving at her mother on every pass. Biscuit clutched against her chest. At around 7:40 p.m., the family stopped at the picnic tables near the concession row. Ruth bought Piper a lemonade. Piper set Biscuit down on the bench beside her. Ruth turned toward the corn dog stand, no more than 15 feet away. The line took 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes. When she turned back, Piper was gone. Ruth wasn't alarmed. Not yet. She looked under the table. She checked the carousel. She called Piper's name, still smiling, still certain. Wade circled the funnel cake stand. Danny ran to the ring toss. The certainty lasted about 10 minutes. Then it started to curdle into something else. By 8:15, Wade had found the fair manager and the music was cut. An announcement went out over the loudspeaker. Piper Grant, 6 years old, red overalls, brown hair. Please come to the main gate. The carousel stopped. People began to look under trailers and behind the game booths. By 9 o'clock, the Caddo County Sheriff's Office had 2 deputies on the grounds. By 10, they had a dozen men walking the wheat field behind the parking lot with flashlights. They found 2 things that night. They found Biscuit, the gray rabbit, sitting exactly where Piper had left it on the picnic bench. Nobody had moved it. She had not gone back for it, and anyone who knew Piper knew she did not go anywhere without that rabbit. That single fact frightened the searchers more than anything else. And near the edge of the gravel lot, past the last row of trucks, they found one of her good sandals, just one, lying in the red dirt at the point where the fairground lights gave way to the dark. There was one more thing, though no one understood it as a thing for a very long time. The woman who ran the lemonade stand told a deputy she thought she'd seen a lady in a blue sundress leading a little girl by the hand toward the far parking lot, sometime around 7:45. The child hadn't been crying. They'd looked, the woman said, like a mother and daughter heading home early. She hadn't gotten a good look. She hadn't thought anything of it. Why would she? That detail went into the case file on a single line, and there it sat, unread. By midnight, the fair was dark, and the whole town was awake. Piper Grant had walked into a summer evening carrying a lemonade and a lucky silver dollar, and she had simply stopped existing. The man who caught the case was a Caddo County investigator named Ray Hollis. He was 44, a former Army MP with a flat-top haircut and a daughter of his own about Piper's age, and the people who worked with him would say for years afterward that the Grant case was the one that put the gray in his hair. In the first 72 hours, Hollis did everything right. He grid-searched the fairgrounds. He interviewed every carnival worker and ran their names. He had the Washita River, low and slow that July, dragged along a 3-mile stretch. Bloodhounds were brought in from Oklahoma City. Volunteers, and in a town like Elk Hollow that meant nearly everyone, walked the wheat fields shoulder to shoulder until the whole section had been crossed twice. The carnival became the focus. It always did, in cases like this. One ride operator, a drifter named Earl with 2 old assault charges out of Texas, looked promising enough that Hollis held him for 36 hours. But 3 separate witnesses put Earl at the tilt-a-whirl at the exact moment Piper vanished, and his truck, when they searched it, held nothing but engine parts and cigarette cartons. He was the perfect suspect. He was also innocent. Hollis let him go, and the best lead the investigation had walked out the door with him. While Hollis worked the official case, the Grants ran their own. Ruth printed 5,000 flyers on the co-op's copier and drove them to every gas station and diner from Anadarko to Chickasha. Wade took a leave from the rigs he could not afford and spent his days walking ditches. Danny, 12 years old, stopped speaking almost entirely. His teacher that fall would note that the boy who could never sit still had gone somewhere inside himself and mostly stayed there. And here is where the case turned, though no one knew it at the time. The theory that took hold in those first weeks, the theory that felt kind, that felt bearable, was that Piper had wandered off in the dark, gotten disoriented, and fallen into the Washita. It explained the sandal. It explained everything except the rabbit and the lemonade lady's blue sundress. But it was the theory that let a small town sleep, and so it won. The active search was scaled back within a month. The river became the working assumption. And the woman leading a child toward the parking lot, the one solid sighting of a person, not a place, was never seriously pursued. Because a drowned little girl needs no abductor. By the first anniversary, in July of 1989, the file was still technically open. In every way that mattered, it was already closed. Ray Hollis kept a copy of Piper's school photo in his desk drawer for the rest of his career. He would tell people, near the end, that he'd always known the river was wrong. He just couldn't prove what was right. The years did what years do. They passed. By 1993, the flyers in the gas station windows had gone yellow and brittle, and one by one they came down, until only the one taped inside the door of the Elk Hollow Dairy Mart remained, faded almost to a ghost, because the owner could not bring himself to take it down. By 1996, Wade Grant's heart gave out on him at 51. In the same ditch he'd been walking for 8 years. The town said it was the Riggs. Ruth knew it was grief. She buried her husband beside an empty plot she'd quietly bought years earlier and never spoken of, the one meant for the daughter she'd never had a body to lay in it. By 2001, Danny Grant was a grown man with a wife and a small construction business 2 counties over. But he kept his little sister's red bicycle in his garage, rust blooming across the fenders, the bent training wheel still clicking if you spun it. He could not explain to his wife why he refused to throw it out. He didn't try. And Ruth never moved. She stayed in the White House at the end of Persimmon Road. She kept Piper's room exactly as it had been. A whole small life frozen in the summer of 1988. Every July, on the night of the 16th, she set a glass of lemonade out on the porch and sat with it until the ice melted. Her friends thought it was heartbreaking. Ruth thought it was the truest thing she did all year. She never once believed her daughter had drowned. A mother knows the difference, she'd say, between a child who is gone and a child who is taken. Every case on this channel represents weeks of digging through old records, court files, and the memories of the people who lived it, piecing back together a real life that was very nearly erased. If you'd like us to keep telling stories like Piper's, the ones the world tried to forget, take a second to like this video, subscribe, and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. It genuinely keeps this work alive. Now, let's go back to Elk Hollow, because after 36 years of silence, the phone was finally about to ring. By 2024, almost everyone who had walked that wheat field on the first night was gone or gray. The fair had long since stopped coming to Caddo County. Ray Hollis was 80 and living in a care home down in Lawton. And 200 miles away, in Joplin, Missouri, a 42-year-old woman named Dana Cole opened a small cardboard box that had arrived in the mail, unscrewed the cap on a plastic vial, and spat into it, because her co-workers had all done one, and it seemed like a bit of harmless fun. Dana Cole was not looking for anything. That is the part everyone would find hardest to believe afterward. She had a good life in Joplin, 2 kids of her own, a job at a dental office, a house with a porch. She had taken the ancestry test the way millions of people do, as a novelty, expecting to learn she was a little Irish, a little German, nothing more. The results came back 6 weeks later on an ordinary Tuesday in October. She opened them on her phone at her kitchen table. And something was wrong. The test worked the way all of them do, by comparing a person's DNA against a database of relatives who have also submitted samples, and estimating how closely they're related. Most people find a few distant cousins. Dana found a woman listed as a parent-child match, a close one, a mother, and the name was not the name of the woman who had raised her. Dana stared at it. She read it again. Ruth Grant, Elk Hollow, Oklahoma, a place she had never been, a woman she had never heard of. And beneath the match sat a message, left waiting on the site for years, from a man named Danny Grant, who had uploaded his family's DNA to every database he could find, year after year, on the slim chance that somewhere, someday, someone would spit into a vial and come back a match to the sister he had never stopped looking for. Dana did not sleep that night. She thought about all the things that had never quite made sense. The complete absence of any photograph of herself before the age of 6 or 7. The way her mother, Marlene, the woman who raised her, had moved them from town to town when she was small, and never once spoken of any family, any grandparents, any past. The way Marlene had flinched, years ago, when a young Dana asked what hospital she'd been born in, and changed the subject, and never let it come up again. The next morning, Dana called the number listed under the match. In Elk Hollow, in the White House at the end of Persimmon Road, an 81-year-old woman named Ruth Grant answered her telephone. A stranger's voice was on the line, shaking, asking a question that made no sense and then, somehow, made all the sense in the world. Ruth would say later that she knew before the woman finished her first sentence. She knew it from the pitch of the voice. It was Wade's voice. It was her own mother's voice. It was, impossibly, the voice of a little girl who used to wave from a carousel. "Is this Piper?" Ruth asked. And on the other end of the line, in a kitchen 200 miles away, a 42-year-old woman who had gone her whole life by the wrong name began, very quietly, to cry. What the Dina had done in an afternoon, the truth took months to fully assemble. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation reopened the case, and a cold case agent named Susan Boyd was assigned to put 36 years back together. Piece by piece, it came clear. The woman who had raised Dana Cole was named Marlene Pruitt. In the summer of 1988, Marlene had been 31 years old and living in a rented house outside Chickasha, 40 minutes from Elk Hollow. 2 years earlier, she had lost her own daughter, a little girl, about 5, to an illness the records describe only in clinical terms. Those who knew Marlene then said the loss unmoored her. She quit her job. She stopped going to church. She began, neighbors would later recall, driving long distances alone to county fairs and church picnics and playgrounds, and sitting in her car for hours, just watching. On the evening of July 16, 1988, Marlene Pruitt was at the Caddo County Fair. She was wearing a blue sundress. Investigators believe she saw Piper alone at the picnic table for the few minutes it took Ruth to buy corn dogs, and that she simply took the child's hand and walked her to the car, past the last row of trucks, and out of that little girl's life. A 6-year-old, in a strange crowd, being led calmly by a smiling grown woman. No one screamed. No one ran. It looked, as the lemonade vendor had said, like a mother taking her daughter home. Within a week, Marlene had moved to Missouri. She told everyone the girl was her own, that they'd just come from out of state. She gave her a new name. And she raised her. Here is the part Agent Boyd said she found hardest to reconcile. She raised her well. Dana Cole grew up believing she was loved, because in Marlene's broken way, she was. There was no chain, no locked room, no monster from a nightmare. There was a grieving woman who wanted a daughter so badly that she stole one, and then spent 30 years terrified of the day the truth would spit itself into a plastic vial. That day, Marlene never lived to see. She had died of cancer in 2019, 5 years before the test, taking her confession with her. There would be no arrest, no trial, no courtroom where Ruth Grant could look her daughter's abductor in the eye. For some in Elk Hollow, that was its own kind of theft, a justice that came too late to be handed to anyone. But there was another kind of justice, and it arrived on a cold morning that November, in the arrivals lane of the Oklahoma City airport. Ruth Grant stood by the doors in her good coat, her son Danny beside her, holding something under his arm. And when a 42-year-old woman came through the sliding doors and stopped and looked and knew, Danny stepped forward and put into her hands the thing he had kept for 36 years. A worn gray rabbit named Biscuit, its ears thin from being held. Piper Grant took it, and she remembered. Not everything, but that. There is a photograph the Grant family has always kept on the mantel. It was taken in the spring of 1988, a few months before the fair. In it, Piper is 6 years old and grinning her gap-toothed grin, sitting on a red bicycle with a bent training wheel, one hand on the handlebars, and the other holding a gray rabbit up toward the camera. She is squinting into the Oklahoma sun. She has no idea what is coming. She is simply, completely happy. For 36 years, that photograph was all Ruth Grant had. These days, the woman in it sits at Ruth's kitchen table on Persimmon Road most Sundays, learning the family she was stolen from, a father she'll never meet, a brother who never once stopped feeding her name into the dark, hoping. She has met the grandmother her own children never knew they had. She has learned the name of the town she was born in. And she has, slowly, begun to answer to Piper again, though she'll tell you both names belong to her now, and neither one is a lie. Ruth Grant is 82. She waited so long that she'd stopped expecting an ending, and kept her faith only out of habit. When people ask her how she knew, how she kept setting out that glass of lemonade every July when the whole world had buried her daughter, she gives the same answer she always gave. A mother knows the difference between gone and taken. She was right for 36 years, against everyone, and being right cost her nearly everything, and gave her, at the very end, the only thing she had ever wanted. Piper's case has since prompted the Osby to re-examine several older Oklahoma disappearances once written off as accidental drownings and runaways, cases where a body was assumed but never found. How many other closed doors, investigators now wonder, were closed too soon? Because that is the quiet lesson of Piper Grant. The most dangerous words in any missing child case are often the ones that bring comfort. She must have wandered off. She must have drowned. Sometimes the kind explanation is simply the one that lets everyone stop looking. And sometimes a mother, sitting alone on a porch with a melting glass of lemonade, is the only person left who still believes the truth. So let me leave you with a few questions. Do you believe justice was truly served in Piper's case, when the woman who took her died before she could ever answer for it? What do you make of the fact that Piper was by every account raised with love? Does that change anything, or nothing at all? And if you were her, learning at 42 that your whole life began with a lie, could you forgive the woman who raised you? Tell us in the comments. Piper Grant came home after 36 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists, because the truth, however late, always finds its way back to the light. If you believe that too, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. and you'll find more solved cold cases waiting for you in the description. Thank you for being here.